Good afternoon, listeners. It's 2 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, and what is it about that Friday feeling? Hey, it's just so nice when you have that feeling of being able to look forward to a weekend. Hey, and just in these COVID times, it feels like there's so little to look forward to, and sometimes when there are things to look forward to, there's the disappointment of it being taken away. Hey, so the little blessings of just being able to indulge the feelings and the slowing down of a Friday afternoon, it's a really good feeling, and I think we should all try where we can to try and embrace that feeling in life. Hey, it's those little things that gives us so much joy. And talking about joy, or sometimes the difficulty of experiencing joy, what I'm going to speak about in today's topic is grief and the grieving process and the mourning process. And as we know, grief shows itself in so many forms. Grief doesn't necessarily always need to mean death, right? Because grief can mean the end of something. Okay, when we think of the end of something, we think the end of a relationship breakdown, the end of a marriage, the end of a season of working in a certain place with retirement, right? We can think of the end of living in a certain country with so much immigration that's happened. And something I can speak personally about in my own experience, that most definitely has been a grieving process. And then, of course, there is also the kind of grief of innocence, lost innocence or lost youth in growing up and just developing and becoming more of an adult. And then also there is the grief that we all know is loss of a loved one. Okay, and sometimes this loss complicates itself in that sometimes that loss can be expected, in that there is an illness and you have time to prepare for the loss, because it goes through various stages where you start seeing the deterioration and you start adjusting your expectations according to what you're seeing. But then there is, of course, the totally unexpected shock of loss, and that's when somebody passes without total expectation. Total freak accidents, going into hospital for certain procedures and something goes wrong and there's a passing. And that's what can make grief so complex. And in that, I think it's important to just acknowledge that grief is universal. Grief is something that everybody is going to be confronted with. Sorry. And grief is something that you can't run away from. It's inevitable. And grief is something that you would most definitely know somebody who has experienced it in some way, shape, or form. But one thing we do know about grief is that there is no universal rule for grief. There's no rule as to how you should grieve. Elizabeth Kübler-Ross wrote a model, which is the grief model. And in this model, she spoke around certain emotions that you go through, not in a chronological order, but we refer to it as DABDA. There's the denial stage, which is where you convince yourself that this hasn't actually happened and you expect the person to walk through the door again and that you'll be together. There's the anger stage, which is where you just get irritable and frustrated and you start lashing out, but it's to things that are totally unrelated to the death at times, and sometimes very much related, perhaps even related to the way people were treating the person or things that were happening at the time. And then there's the bargaining stage where you think, well, maybe if I had have noticed this, then he or she wouldn't have gotten sick, or maybe if I prevented them from having the operation, then this wouldn't have happened. So the bargaining stage is about your brain really looking at how could I have undone this so that we still have this person with us. And then there's obviously the depression stage, and this is an important thing that I want to highlight for today, is that the depression stage is inevitable. Grief mimics depression. So if you want to know what depression feels like, and you've never had depression in your life before, when you lost a loved one, someone close to you, and you go low, that's depression. Okay, so usually when someone has lost a loved one, it is very common to put that person on an antidepressant. And usually when someone has lost a loved one and it's been in a totally shocking, unexpected way, it is also normal to put someone on an antidepressant because they're going to be mimicking depression and not coping. But in addition to that, they will also get put on a tranquilizer because your brain is actually struggling to adjust to what this new reality is, and actually struggling to adjust to the news that you've received because you'd be in shock. So the tranquilizer just helps your brain to actually numb out from reality a little bit, because the reality is so starking and overwhelming. So what you would normally do then is initially, this tranquilizer would be not necessarily be something you take every day. It's not good to take a tranquilizer every day because they're hugely addictive. But it would just be there for when needed, when you're just totally overwhelmed by the enormity of the reality right now. So going back to Elizabeth Kübler-Ross's model of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, the last phase is the acceptance phase, and that's the only one that has an order in that it's near the end. And the others can go in any format. They can even have two at the same time. You can whirl through periods of being in denial that it's happened and be angry that it's happened. You can kind of whirl between periods of anger and periods of depression. So there's no specific way that it needs to be, but she said that she'd recognized that these were the most formidable emotions and stages to go through in the grief process. So I just want to start by highlighting that for this session. In our next session, we're going to talk about some other kind of experiences and steps for grief. So I look forward to chatting to you about it then.